On a Wednesday morning in late September of 1994, a woman named Adeline Marsh drove 4 hours from Knoxville to a farm auction outside of Harlan County, Kentucky, with $175 in a manila envelope tucked into the inside pocket of her coat and a feeling she could not quite name but which had kept her awake since Sunday. She was 51 years old. She had not been back to Harlan County in 11 years. She had not intended to come back at all. It almost didn't matter. Let me tell you why. Let me tell you about Noel Marsh first. Because you cannot understand what his daughter found in that pottery shed without understanding the man who built it. Noel Marsh had come to Harlan County from eastern Tennessee in 1948 with a second-hand kick wheel, a rented truck, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided at 26 that he was going to spend his doing one thing and doing it correctly. He had grown up watching his mother throw pots on a wheel she had made herself from salvaged lumber and a bicycle hub, and he had understood from childhood that clay was not a material so much as a conversation. You asked it questions. It answered slowly. You had to be patient enough to hear what it said. He settled on 12 acres outside of Loyal and built a kiln in the first year from fire brick he sourced from a demolished steel plant in Middlesboro. He built the shed around the kiln the following year, a low, wide structure with a corrugated roof and a packed earth floor that he later poured concrete over in sections as he could afford the materials. He threw functional ware, pitchers, bowls, mugs, lidded crocks, and sold it at the farmers' market in Harlan on Saturdays and occasionally to a general store in Cumberland that stocked local goods on a shelf near the front door. He was not a famous potter. He was not a pottery teacher or a gallery artist or a man who received grants from foundations that supported traditional Appalachian craft. He was a man who made things that people used, and he made them with a consistency and a precision that the people who bought them noticed without being able to say exactly why. The way you notice when a door hangs exactly right in its frame without knowing anything about carpentry. Noel threw pots every day for 41 years. He died in the summer of 1993 at 71 of a stroke that took him between a Tuesday evening and a Wednesday morning, quietly in the house he had lived in since 1952. His neighbor, Charlene Fugate, found him when he didn't come to pick up the eggs she left on his porch every Wednesday. She said later that the house looked exactly like it always did, tools put away, wheel clean, a mug of cold coffee on the workbench, as if he had stepped out and simply forgotten to come back. Adeline was the younger of 2 children. She had left Harlan County at 22 to attend the University of Tennessee, had studied materials science, and had spent the following 2 decades working for a ceramics manufacturing company in Knoxville that made industrial components, heat-resistant liners for industrial kilns, high-temperature gaskets, specialty refractories. She was good at her work. She understood materials behavior at a molecular level that her father would never have been able to articulate in technical language, but that he had understood, she believed, through his hands and through 40 years of watching clay respond to heat in ways that were precise and repeatable, and, to someone who knew what they were looking at, entirely predictable. She had not come home often. The drive was long, and the hours at the company were longer, and there was always a reason to wait until the next holiday, the next summer, the next time things slowed down. This was not a source of argument between her and Noel. He was not a man who pressed people for things they were not offering. He sent her Christmas cards with short notes about the weather and the garden, and which neighbors had moved away or passed on, and she called on his birthday and at Easter, and this had been the shape of their relationship for 11 years, which was long enough that the shape had started to feel like the thing itself rather than a substitute for it. When Noel died and the estate was sorted out, The 12 acres and the house were inherited jointly by Adeline and her older brother, a man named Kenneth, who had lived in Columbus for 20 years, and who had even less connection to Harlan County than Adeline did. Kenneth wanted to sell. Adeline had agreed because she was not prepared to disagree, because disagreeing would have required her to explain what she thought the property was worth, and she was not ready, in the weeks after her father's death, to have that conversation with herself, let alone with Kenneth. What she had not agreed to, without realizing she was agreeing to it, was the estate sale company that Kenneth hired to clear the contents of the shed. Let me tell you about the Saturday 2 weeks before the auction, because that is where this story actually begins. Adeline drove up from Knoxville on a Saturday in early September, alone, telling herself she was going to help sort through the house and make sure anything sentimental got set aside before the sale. She had expected it to be hard, going through a dead man's belongings. She had not expected what she found when she opened the shed. The shed was exactly as Noel had left it. The kick wheel stood in the center of the space with a thin skim of dried slip on the splash pan the way it always had. The electric wheel he had acquired in 1979 sat against the east wall. The shelves along the north wall held greenware and bisqueware in various stages of completion, pitchers and bowls, and the lidded crocks that were his standard production forms, as if he had simply stepped away from a normal Tuesday and would be back after lunch to trim the bottoms. But it was the south wall that stopped Adeline in the doorway with her hand still on the latch. Along the south wall, on a workbench that Noel had built from oak boards in 1961, were the glazes. Not finished glazes in labeled buckets, though there were those too, stacked in careful rows on the lower shelves. What was on the bench itself was something different. There were notebooks, not 4 like her father's contemporaries might have kept, but 11, a mix of composition notebooks and spiral-bound laboratory notebooks of the kind Adeline recognized from her work, with waterproof covers and pages that resisted moisture. Beside the notebooks were sample tiles, hundreds of them, arranged on wooden trays in grid formations and labeled in Noel's small, compressed handwriting with formulas and firing temperatures and atmospheric conditions: reduction, oxidation, cone 9, cone 10, cone 6. Some of them were labeled with dates going back to 1955, and the glazes themselves were in small jars on the back of the bench, dry mixed and sealed with wax paper secured by rubber bands, each one labeled with a code that corresponded to entries in the notebooks. 41 years of glaze development, cataloged and cross-referenced and stored with the methodical precision of a research chemist. Adeline stood at that bench for a long time. She was a materials scientist. She understood what she was looking at in a way that very few people in Harlan County, or anywhere, would have understood it. She picked up a notebook and opened it to a page from 1967 and read her father's notes on a series of iron saturate glazes he had been developing, the specific ratio of iron oxide to silica to alumina that produced a particular surface quality he had been chasing, his notes on how the result changed with different rates of cooling, his observations on the relationship between clay body porosity and glaze fit in cold, damp storage conditions. She stood there and read for 2 hours. She did not cry exactly, but she sat down on a stool at the end of the bench and did not move for a long time. The problem was the estate sale company. They had come in the previous week, 2 people with a camera and a pricing sheet, and they had walked through the shed the way people walk through spaces they are assessing rather than understanding. Adeline had not been there when they came through. She had arrived to find their stickers already on everything. The kick wheel had a sticker on it. The electric wheel had a sticker. The shelves of finished pots had individual stickers. And the workbench, the notebooks, the sample tiles, The sealed jars of dry mixed glazes, the 41 years of documented research, had a single sticker on the edge of the bench that read $125 for the lot. Adeline stood in front of that sticker for a long moment. She had spent 20 years in industrial ceramics. She understood glaze chemistry at a level that had taken her a decade of professional work to develop. And what was in those notebooks was not the output of professional training. It was something rarer than that. It was the accumulated observation of a man who had learned to read materials the way a gifted doctor learns to read patients, not from textbooks alone, but from years of paying attention to things that most people look at without seeing. The glaze formulas in those notebooks were not reproductions of published recipes. She could tell that from the first notebook she had opened. They were original formulations. Noel had developed them through decades of systematic testing, adjusting variables, recording results, and adjusting again, the same empirical process she used in her professional work, but applied without instruments more sophisticated than a pyrometer and his own eyes, over a span of time that no academic research program would have funded or even conceived of as a research methodology. She knew what those notebooks were worth to a serious studio potter. She knew what the glaze formulas would mean to someone working in reduction stoneware who had been chasing the same surface qualities her father had documented achieving in 1971. She also knew something the estate sale company could not have known and would not have known how to value if they had. She knew that the notebooks were not just formulas. They were explanations. Her father had written down not only what he did but why he believed it worked, and where he had been wrong before he was right, and what the wrong results had taught him. That was not a collection of recipes. That was a body of knowledge. She went back to Knoxville on Sunday. She thought about it for 2 days. She came back on Wednesday morning with $175 in a manila envelope and the specific intention of being at that auction when the workbench lot came up for bid. Now let me tell you about what happened at that auction, because it is not the story you might expect. The sale drew about 40 people, which was a modest crowd for a farm estate in Harlan County. Most of them were there for the furniture and the household goods. A few collectors had come for the finished pots, which were priced reasonably, and which attracted a small cluster of people who had been buying Noel's work at the farmer's market for years, and who seemed, Adeline thought, to be only now realizing what they had been looking at every Saturday morning. The shed contents were scheduled for mid-morning. Adeline positioned herself near the workbench early. She had been watching since the sale opened, the way you watch a room when something in it matters to you, and you are trying not to show how much. She noticed one other person doing the same thing. He was a man in his late 40s, trim, with a canvas jacket and a notebook of his own tucked under his arm, standing near the south wall with the unhurried attention of someone who had come specifically for something and was in no rush to reveal which thing. He had looked at the sample tiles for a long time. He had picked up one of the small sealed glaze jars and read the label carefully before setting it back down. Men who read labels at estate sales are not casual browsers. The auctioneer reached the workbench lot at 11 in the morning. He described it the way auctioneers describe things they cannot categorize: pottery-related materials, assorted notebooks and samples, glazing supplies and dry materials, wooden trays, a number of small jars. He started the bidding at $40. The man in the canvas jacket bid immediately. Adeline bid. The man bid again. Adeline bid. A woman near the back raised her hand, looked at the bench more carefully, and did not bid again. At $125, it was Adeline and the man in the canvas jacket. He bid $150. She bid $175. He looked at the bench. He looked at Adeline. Something shifted in his expression, Not defeat exactly, but a recalibration, the look of a man who has just understood that the person across from him knows something he doesn't, and is deciding whether to find out what it is at someone else's price or let it go. He let it go. The gavel came down at $175. Adeline loaded everything into her car that afternoon. The notebooks, the sample tiles, the trays, the sealed jars, the stool from the end of the bench that she took without quite deciding to take it. She drove back to Knoxville and carried it all into her apartment, where it covered her kitchen table and half of her living room floor for 2 weeks while she tried to figure out what she was going to do with it. She had not bought it as an investment. She had bought it because leaving it felt wrong in a way she could not have explained to Kenneth and did not try to. She bought it because she was a materials scientist who understood what it represented, and because the thought of those notebooks going to someone who would copy a few formulas and discard the rest, or worse, to no one at all, was not something she could stand. But sitting in her apartment in Knoxville, in stacks on her floor, it wasn't doing anything either. So she started reading. It took her most of October. She read in the evenings at the kitchen table, with the lamp pulled close, the way she read technical documents at work, but with a different kind of attention, because these were not technical documents exactly. They were something more personal and more strange. A record of a man talking to himself across 4 decades, working through problems in writing, because writing helped him think, recording failures as carefully as successes, because the failures were where the actual learning happened. Noel had been wrong many times, and had written down every time he was wrong, and why he thought he had been wrong, and what he had changed, and whether the change had produced what he expected, or something else entirely. He had developed not just formulas but a way of thinking about glaze chemistry that Adeline recognized, from her professional training, as a genuine theoretical framework. Not the formal framework she had learned in graduate school, with its precise mathematical models. Something more intuitive and more durable, built from decades of observation rather than from equations, but converging on the same principles from a different direction entirely. She finished the last notebook in early November and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she called a woman she had known since graduate school, a woman named Petra Sundquist, who ran a studio pottery program at a small arts college in Asheville, and who had, over the years, developed a regional reputation for her work in wood-fired stoneware. Adeline had not talked to Petra in 2 years. She told Petra what she had found. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Adeline, I need to see those notebooks." Adeline drove to Asheville the following weekend. Petra spent a Saturday afternoon at her studio table with the notebooks, reading slowly, stopping occasionally to hold a sample tile up to the light, or to compare a formula entry against something in her own reference materials. Adeline sat across from her and watched. At one point, Petra stopped and looked up and said, "Where did your father study?" Adeline said he hadn't. He had learned from his mother, who had learned from hers, and beyond that, from 40 years of working alone in a shed in Harlan County. Petra looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to reading. When she finished the last notebook, she set it down in the particular careful way. You set down something you understand is not yours to handle carelessly, and said, "These glaze sequences he developed in the 1970s, the iron saturate series. I have spent 8 years trying to arrive at what he documented achieving in 1973, and I'm still not there." She paused. "You understand that this is not in any published reference? This is not in Rhodes. This is not in Hamer. This is something your father worked out by himself over a very long time and wrote down because he was a thorough man." She paused again. "What are you going to do with them?" Adeline had been thinking about that for 6 weeks. She said she wasn't sure yet. Petra said, Don't let them sit on the floor. Let me tell you about the winter of 1993 and 94, because that is when Adeline Marsh made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. She had been at the manufacturing company in Knoxville for 19 years. She was good at her job. She had a senior research position and a salary that reflected it, and a professional life that was stable and respected and entirely correct in every way except one. It had nothing to do with the things she had learned, reading those notebooks at her kitchen table in October, that she had spent her adult life keeping at a careful distance from. She left the company in January of 1994. She drove to Harlan County, bought back the shed and the 12 acres from Kenneth with money she had saved and a stubbornness that surprised them both, and spent 4 months setting the space back in order. She restored the kick wheel. She rebuilt the kiln elements. She set up the workbench the same way her father had kept it, notebooks at the end, sample tiles in their trays, tools in their places. She realized, stepping back to look at it one afternoon, that she had arranged everything the way she had seen it, arranged as a child, her hands remembering an order she had not consciously known she had stored. She opened that spring as a studio potter, specializing in the high fire reduction stoneware her father had worked in his whole life, and she began working her way through the notebooks systematically, testing his formulas, verifying his results, extending the work where she could. She was not, at the beginning, a very good potter. Her materials science background gave her an understanding of the chemistry that her father had lacked, but she lacked the bodily knowledge, the felt sense in the hands that comes only from years of working at the wheel. She threw awkward forms that first year. She had Petra's honest assessment of them, delivered without cruel over the phone. She threw every day and got better slowly and did not stop. In the second year she began to find students. Not in any organized way, but because word traveled the way. Word travels in small craft communities. A potter in Middlesboro heard about the shed and drove over to see it. A young woman from Berea came to look at the sample tiles and stayed for 3 hours. Adeline began answering questions, then holding informal sessions, then, almost without deciding to, teaching a small number of serious students in the shed on weekend mornings. Now let me pause here and ask you something, because I want you to think about what Adeline Marsh actually did in that moment at the auction, and what it cost and what it returned. She spent $175. She spent 19 years of a career that was secure and well compensated and not quite hers. She spent a decade of awkward mornings at the wheel, learning through her hands what her father had learned through his. And in exchange, she received a second life built from a first one she had never fully understood while it was being lived, and a body of work that existed nowhere else in the world, and the particular satisfaction of a woman who is finally doing exactly what she was built to do. That is not a small accounting. But let me tell you about the part of this story that most people don't know, because it doesn't end with the auction or with Adeline. Let me tell you about the man in the canvas jacket. His name was Dwight Solberg, and he was 47 years old in September of 1994, and he owned a small gallery in Berea, Kentucky, that sold regional craft work, furniture, baskets, pottery, woven goods, sourced from makers across the eastern part of the state. He had been buying and selling Appalachian craft work for 20 years. He had a good eye for quality and a thorough knowledge of what the market would bear, and he had learned, over 2 decades, to trust his eye over his ear, meaning he trusted what he saw in the object over what he was told about it. Dwight had known of Noel Marsh the way gallery owners know of productive craftspeople who do not sell through galleries. By reputation, by the work itself, by the consistent reports from customers who had bought Noel's pots at the farmer's market, and who mentioned them in the way people mention things that have quietly exceeded their expectations. He had never carried Noel's work because Noel had never brought it to him, which Dwight had attributed to the stubbornness common to older craftsmen who had established their own distribution and saw no reason to change it. When he heard about the estate sale, Dwight had gone with the specific intention of acquiring work for the gallery's inventory and the vague additional intention of looking at whatever materials might be in the studio. He had recognized, looking at the workbench, that the notebooks and tiles represented something significant without being able to fully articulate what. He had bid to what the market logic of his experience told him the lot was worth, and had stopped when he encountered a resistance he couldn't explain. He had seen in Adeline's stillness something he recognized from 20 years of watching people at auction. The stillness of a person who is not going to move. He thought about that auction for months. He thought about it the way you think about a conversation in which you said the wrong thing and did not realize it until afterward, not because you were dishonest, but because you did not yet understand what was actually being discussed. Let me tell you about the afternoon in the spring of 1996 when Dwight Solberg drove to Harlan County. He had been hearing the name the name Marsh, from customers. Not complaints. References. A studio potter in Clay County who had attended one of Adeline's informal sessions and come back using a glaze formulation that was producing surfaces nobody at the local arts council could account for. A ceramic arts instructor at a community college in Harlan who had heard about the notebooks and asked carefully whether they might be available for study. A restorer in Asheville. Petra's circle, he suspected, who had mentioned in passing that there was work being done in a shed in Harlan County that was worth paying attention to. Dwight drove down on a Thursday afternoon and found the shed without difficulty. There was no sign, but there was smoke from the kiln and 3 cars parked on the grass outside, which told him the session he had heard about was in progress. He went inside. Adeline was at the kick wheel. 2 students were at work tables trimming pots. A third was at the south end of the bench, reading a notebook with the focused stillness that notebooks earn from certain readers. Adeline looked up when Dwight came in, but did not stop the wheel. He said he had been hearing about the studio. She said she was glad to hear it. He looked around at the bench, the sample tiles in their trays, the sealed jars lined up in their order, the notebooks stacked at the end, and something crossed his face that was not quite recognition but was close to it. He said, "That's the same bench setup as the auction." Adeline stopped the wheel. She said, "It is." There was a pause. Dwight looked at the tiles for a moment. Then he said, "I have a collector in Lexington who has been looking for reduction stoneware with a particular kind of iron surface, the kind that comes from very specific atmospheric control and a glaze that's been dialed in over a long time. My best sources have been unable to produce what she's looking for consistently." Adeline said, "What does she mean by a particular kind of iron surface?" Dwight described it. He used the language of a gallery owner, which was the language of visual effect and collector preference, not the language of chemistry. Adeline listened and then said, "She's describing a fully reduced iron saturate, where the iron has crystallized at the surface during cooling rather than remaining in suspension in the glass. The effect she wants comes from a very specific cooling rate in the last 200 degrees and a glaze with an iron content between 12 and 14% in a low alumina matrix." She paused. "My father documented the firing schedule for that result in 1971. The formula is in the 7th notebook. I've been able to reproduce it consistently since last fall." Dwight looked at her. He said, "How do you know it's the cooling rate? she said, because that's what produces crystallization in iron-saturate glazes. Slow it down, and you get crystals. Speed it up, and the iron stays in suspension, and you get a different surface entirely. The cooling rate is the variable. The glaze is just the starting point. She paused. It took my father 11 years to work that out. He wrote down every firing, everything he tried that didn't work. The record of what didn't work is more useful than the formulas in some ways because it tells you the boundary conditions. Dwight was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can you produce 6 pieces for the Lexington collector by fall?" Adeline said she could. She produced 8. The collector acquired all 8 and placed a standing order for whatever Adeline produced in that series going forward. Dwight told 2 other galleries. By the end of 1997, there was a waiting list for Adeline's work, and Dwight Solberg had become, in the particular way that market people become things, not a champion or a collaborator, but a conduit, accurate and useful and honest about what he did not know. What Dwight also did, 6 months after the Iron Surface Commission, was drive back to Harlan County on a Saturday morning and ask if he could read the notebooks. Adeline said yes. He sat at the end of the bench for most of an afternoon, reading slowly, stopping to look at the sample tiles, asking occasional questions that Adeline answered from across the room without looking up from the wheel. When he finished, he sat for a while. Then he said, "Your father understood something about glaze development that I have never seen documented anywhere else, and I have been looking at craft work my entire adult life." Adeline said, "I know." Dwight said, "I should have bid higher at the auction." Adeline said, "Yes, you should have." That was as close as either of them came to discussing what had happened in September of 1994. And it was enough. Let me tell you about what Adeline Marsh built over the following decade, because the studio in Harlan County was only the beginning of it. By 2002, she had taken on 2 full-time students who were working toward their own practices and who were, in the way that serious students absorb things, internalizing not just the formulas in the notebooks, but the way of thinking that had produced the formulas. She had expanded the kiln twice. She had acquired, through estate contacts and a network of potters and collectors that extended across 8 states, a collection of historical glaze materials and early 20th century ceramic chemistry documents that she cross-referenced against her father's work. And she had done something Noel had never done, which was to write it down for an audience. Adeline spent the winters of 2000 and 2001 organizing the 11 notebooks into a single referenced document, cross-indexing the formulas against her own test results and against the ceramic chemistry literature that her professional background allowed her to access. She added a technical introduction that translated her father's intuitive framework into formal materials science terms without losing what was irreducible about it, which was the precision that could only come from 40 years of direct observation. The document ran to 290 pages. She had it printed through a small press in Knoxville and distributed it through a network of studio potters and ceramic arts programs. She priced it at $35. The first run of 400 copies sold out in 5 months. She printed 600 more. Those sold out in less than a year. Letters came from studio potters and ceramic arts instructors and materials scientists in 17 states and 4 countries. The dedication read, "For Noel Marsh, who paid attention." Let me tell you about the afternoon in the fall of 2004 when a young woman came into the shed in Harlan County. Her name was Simone, and she was 24 years old, and she was Adeline's niece, Kenneth's younger daughter, who had grown up in Columbus and who had spent 2 summers in the shed as a teenager doing whatever needed doing, and who had developed in the way that young people develop things when they are allowed to simply be present in a working space without being taught at, a relationship with the materials that went deeper than she had words for. Simone had studied fine arts at Ohio State. She had graduated in the spring and spent 4 months traveling and had come to Harlan County not entirely sure why, or so she said. She sat down at the end of the bench on the stool that was always there and said she had been thinking about what was missing in the conversation around contemporary ceramics. Adeline waited. Simone said she thought the field was very focused on form and concept and not focused enough on material knowledge as its own kind of knowledge, the kind that resides in the body and the observation record and doesn't translate easily into artist statements or grant applications. She said she thought someone should be doing the work of connecting contemporary practice to the documented historical knowledge before the people who held that knowledge were gone. Adeline looked at her niece for a moment. She thought about a Wednesday morning in September of 1994 and a shed and 11 notebooks and a man who had spent 41 years paying attention to clay and fire and writing down everything he observed for no audience at all. She thought about what it had cost to almost lose that. She said, "Start with the cooling rate work. There's a series of test results from the 1970s that nobody has fully replicated because the documentation assumes knowledge of the kiln's particular behavior that isn't written explicitly anywhere. Work through them with me and keep your own notes." Simone said, "You're sure?" Adeline said, "Start today." Simone Marsh spent 3 years working alongside her aunt, and the years after that working increasingly on her own and eventually on work that extended the knowledge in directions that Noel had not pursued and that Adeline had not had time to pursue, into lower temperature bodies, into alternative fuel sources, into the documentation of atmospheric effects that the shift to electric kilns had made nearly obsolete among practicing potters. She dedicated her first published reference to her great-uncle, whom she had never met, and her second to her aunt, and her third to the students who had come to the shed in Harlan County over 20 years and asked good questions and written down the answers. The shed is still there. Simone works in it now and teaches in it and continues the systematic testing that Noel began in 1952 and that Adeline carried forward from 1994, and that shows no signs of concluding because the questions that serious work in materials generates are not the kind that terminate in final answers. Adeline retired from daily studio work in 2015, but still comes in on Saturdays to throw, which is what she told Simone she would always do, and which is what she has done. She works slowly now. She has the particular unhurried quality of someone who has stopped trying to produce and is simply doing the thing for the reason it was always worth doing. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story does not end with Adeline or with Simone. Let me tell you about Dwight Solberg, because he has one more appearance here and it matters. Dwight sold the gallery in Berea in 2008 when he was 61 to a woman who had worked for him for 12 years and who kept it running the way he had run it, which was the best outcome he could have hoped for. He retired to a house outside of Berea with a workshop that he had told himself for years he would someday use. He had spent 40 years handling other people's craft work. He had never made anything himself. He started at 61 learning to throw pots on a wheel he bought secondhand from a retiring potter in Richmond. He was not, at first, remotely competent. He had handled thousands of pots and understood their surfaces and weights and proportions at level of a man who has paid close attention for a very long time. But his hands knew none of it. He threw cylinders that collapsed. He threw bowls with walls that were thick on one side and paper-thin on the other. He drove to Harlan County 4 times in the first year, not to ask Adeline to fix anything but to sit in the shed and watch and ask questions that she answered without condescension and with the patience of a woman who has spent her life explaining things to people who are genuinely willing to learn. He bought her reference document and read it twice. He worked through the sample tile sequences in the notebooks, reproducing them at his own scale, recording his results. He found that the act of keeping records changed the way he looked at what he was doing. Not because the records revealed things immediately, but because the discipline of writing things down made him pay a different kind of attention. In 2011, Dwight donated to the studio in Harlan County a collection of historical ceramic chemistry documents he had accumulated over 40 years of handling estate materials from the region. Exhibition catalogs with technical notes, unpublished glazed notebooks from 2 other potters he had represented, a box of correspondence between ceramic artists and material suppliers from the 1940s and 1950s that had come to him in a lot from a closed gallery in Lexington and that he had never known what to do with. He drove it to Harlan County himself and helped carry it in. When it was done, he stood in the shed and looked at the bench, Adeline's bench arranged the same way Noel's had been, and he said, "I should have brought this years ago." Adeline said, "You brought it now." Dwight said, "I keep coming back to that auction. I keep thinking about what I almost walked out with and didn't." Adeline said, "What do you think you almost walked out with?" He thought about it. He said, "I think I almost bought 40 years of a man learning to see things that aren't visible to anyone who hasn't done the same work. And I didn't know that's what it was because I was looking at it the way I look at inventory." Adeline said, "I didn't know it either. Not until I read the notebooks." Dwight drove back to Berea that evening. He kept throwing pots until his shoulder gave out at 68, and in those 7 years he finished the work that a serious beginner can finish, which is not very much measured against a lifetime, but which is measured against nothing, a great deal. He kept records of everything. When he died in 2016, his family found in the workshop a stack of 3 notebooks, composition notebooks with marbled covers, in which he had recorded in careful handwriting his glaze tests and firing results and the particular observations that he had not known, until he started writing them down that he had been accumulating. The notebooks were not as comprehensive as Noel's. They did not represent 40 years of concentrated knowledge, but they were precise, and they were honest, and they were written by a man who had finally stopped evaluating materials from the outside and had begun, at the age of 61, to understand them from within. Simone has them on the shelf above the workbench in the Harlan County shed, next to Noel's 11 notebooks and Adeline's working journals and the technical references that 2 generations of Marsh women produced from what they learned in that shed. She found Dwight's notebooks in the box of ceramic chemistry documents he had donated, tucked into the back behind the 1940s correspondence, where they had apparently sat for 5 years without anyone knowing they were there. She read them on a Saturday afternoon, sitting on the stool at the end of the bench, in the same posture her aunt had used reading her grandfather's notebooks in 1993, in the same shed, in the same light. When she finished, she sat for a while. Then she put them on the shelf where they belong, among the records of the people who paid attention and wrote it down, and the people who almost understood and eventually did, and the long, patient thread of work that runs between them. Some knowledge doesn't disappear. It just waits in a shed somewhere for the person who knows how to read it.